It all happened in an instant. Bella barely felt the cut on her finger when the scent of her blood filled the air. It wasn't a serious accident, just a tiny scratch on the tip of her finger. But Jasper felt it as if it were a flood. The change in his expression was immediate. A growl escaped his throat before he could stop it. Alice screamed his name, but she wasn't fast enough. Neither was Edward. Jasper had already lunged at Bella, and this time, no one could stop him in time. The impact was brutal. Bella felt a sharp blow to her chest before her back slammed against the glass table. The air rushed from her lungs in a ragged gasp. There was a loud crash as the table shattered beneath her weight. And then came the pain. Not like the scratch on her finger. No, much worse. Her ribs compressed under Jasper's weight. The cold claws of his hand tore through her skin effortlessly, ripping it as if it were paper. The pain was sharp, searing, excruciating. Bella tried to scream, but the pressure on her chest stole her breath away. Blood gushed from her abdomen in a hot, crimson torrent, and Jasper lost control completely. Edward shoved him away in an instant, but not fast enough. Jasper had tasted the blood. He had savored its warmth in the air. His eyes were a hellish mix of red and black when Edward hurled him against the wall with brutal force. The impact shattered the bookshelf behind him. Jasper snarled and lunged at Bella again without thinking. It was Emmett who stopped him this time. Alice screamed. Carlisle rushed toward Bella, his hands covered in blood. But Edward was frozen. He stared at Bella, the color draining from his face. No, his voice broke. He saw her trembling, her eyes wide, her blouse soaked in red. He saw her struggling to breathe, her lips parting in a desperate attempt to speak. Bella. Her trembling fingers touched the wound, and then he realized. She was dying. Chaos erupted in the room. Alice and Rosalie managed to restrain Jasper, pinning him to the ground as he growled and struggled to break free. Emmett stood between them and Bella, ready to act if anyone else lost control. But Carlisle had no time to worry about that. He pressed down on the wound with both hands, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was deep. Too deep. Bella gasped, fighting to breathe, her body trembling with pain. Her eyes searched for Edward, but Edward still didn't move. He didn't hear his siblings' screams. He didn't see the chaos around him. He only saw the blood on his hands. Bella was going to die, and it was all his fault. Carlisle looked up. Edward, nothing. Edward, look at me. His voice was like a whip, snapping Edward out of his trance. Carlisle took a deep breath. We can't stop the bleeding. Edward shook his head. No, there's only one way to save her. Edward's eyes widened. He knew what Carlisle meant. Turn her. Now, or lose her forever. Edward felt the tremor in his own body. He couldn't do this to her. He couldn't condemn her to this life. But if he didn't, Bella would die. Edward trembled, and deep inside he knew he had no choice. He leaned over her, his jaw clenched, his unnecessary breath coming in uneven bursts. I'm sorry. Bella blinked slowly, struggling to focus. And then, his fangs sank into her skin. Bella's blood touched his tongue, and Edward felt fire in his throat, not from thirst, but from what he had just done. Because in that instant, as the venom spread through her body, sealing her fate, Bella ceased to be human, and Edward ceased to be her savior, forever. Bella's scream tore through the silence. It wasn't a human sound. It was a howl of absolute pain, an agony beyond words. Edward held her in his arms, his fangs still marking the wound on her neck. The venom was already spreading. The transformation had begun, and there was no turning back. Carlisle watched with a tense expression. He had seen many transformations before. He knew what came next. We need to take her upstairs, he said quietly. Edward didn't move. Bella writhed on the floor, her hands clutching the carpet as if trying to resist the inevitable. Edward, Esme's voice was a pleading whisper, but he couldn't let go, because he knew that once he did, Bella would never be the same again. Alice and Emmett dragged Jasper out of the house. He was still shaking, his body trembling with the insatiable desire for more blood. I shouldn't have come, he said through gritted teeth, his voice broken. Alice didn't answer. She couldn't, because she knew it too. This wasn't just a mistake. This was the mistake, the one that would change their lives forever. 3 days passed. Edward never left her side. Every scream from Bella was a dagger to his soul. He knew what she was feeling, the fire, the venom consuming her body, rebuilding it into something new, something impossible. But it wasn't just that which tormented him. It was the fact that Bella hadn't chosen this. It had been forced upon her. And when finally, after what felt like an eternity, Bella opened her eyes, Edward felt his non-existent heart shatter, because the Bella who looked at him was not the same. Red eyes glowed in the dim light. A new silence fell over the room. Edward held his breath. Bella remained still. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just listened. Every sound, every breath, every particle of dust floating in the air. The whole world was too much. Bella. Edward's voice was barely a whisper. She turned her head toward him, too fast, too precise. The change was absolute. Edward. Her voice was different, clearer, more dangerous. And then the scent hit her. Her nose wrinkled. Blood. Edward's breath was shallow. Bella blinked, and she felt the thirst. The fire wasn't gone. It wasn't like the pain of the transformation, but it was a hunger that would never fade. Bella closed her eyes. The memories hit her all at once. The party, the blood, Jasper, Edward biting her. And she understood everything. Forever. No. She stood so fast the air cracked around her. No. She stumbled backward, her hands clawing at her own skin, as if she could tear the monstrosity from her body. Edward tried to step closer. Bella growled, a low animalistic sound, impossible to suppress. Edward froze immediately. Bella covered her mouth with her hands. What am I? Edward lowered his gaze. I'm sorry. The words meant nothing. They couldn't change what was already irreversible. Bella would never see the sun without fear again. She would never feel her own heartbeat again. She would never embrace Charlie without the risk of killing him. And then she understood. She hadn't just lost her humanity. She had lost everything. Bella stood completely still, and when she spoke again, her voice was a sharp whisper. You took my life. Edward closed his eyes, because he knew it was true. The Cullens tried to help her. They taught her to hunt, to control her thirst, but nothing was enough. Bella never felt like them. She never felt like part of the family. She was something else, something broken. And worst of all, Edward knew it. Every time he looked at her, he saw the resentment in her eyes. Every time they spoke, he felt the distance between them grow. Bella was no longer human, but she also wasn't the vampire he had imagined. She wasn't the Bella he had loved. She was something else. And reality hit him like a death sentence. Maybe she would never forgive him. Maybe this story was never meant to have a happy ending, because the Bella he loved had died in that living room that night, and what was left behind was just a reflection of what once was.